Afternoon, friends. Weather isn't great these days, very rainy. I wanted to talk about what they call the regulatory moat, which is the concept of when an authority or government of some sort regulates to the point where compliance becomes such a burden that it's very difficult for small businesses to comply, and it effectively makes the market unfeasible for smaller players. And usually what ends up happening is that bigger companies can comply, smaller companies can't, so small companies disappear. New companies don't really happen unless they have a lot of funding, and the bigger players just consolidate the market and have a great time. And this is always a balance in any policy making. If you regulate, you're ultimately creating rules that someone needs to follow, paperwork, that is an operational challenge for people who have to follow it, companies that have to follow it. So it's always a balance. And I think talking about this, the EU is a very common. This is commonly brought up when people discuss the EU, and there's the EU has a history of doing this in such a way that that the regulatory moat becomes a problem. So people often point to GDPR as an example. So I have been on both sides of GDPR. As a consumer, I have gone and I did you could say like an investigation where I GDPR something like 100-200 companies just to see if it's real. And this is probably a separate topic. Spoiler, it's let's just say GDPR is the best effort. But anyway, GDPR created a lot of work for companies, and especially so smaller companies. It was a big headache, cost a lot of money. We've also seen this with payments in the EU, and these things, they tend to go both ways, right? There's no, it's not like a binary, one or the other. Often, like the payments, PSD2, the payments directive, it made it easier for consumers to move between banks, but banks themselves have to implement the regulation. So it's a burden on the banks, but which could argue that it's difficult for people to open a new bank, but it made the market more competitive. So it's complicated, but that's this concept of a regulatory mode. And I noticed it myself now in I guess food and beverage. So I deal with food suppliers, and what happens is that the small independent farmers tend to make higher quality products at a lower cost, and I would like to buy from them, but they do not have all the ISO certifications, they don't have all the kind of pesticide reports, things like that. So they're missing all the paperwork, because paperwork costs money. So I can't do business with them because my clients, they ask for all this paperwork. So I say my clients, also, like I ship internationally, a lot of governments also, and authorities, customs authorities, they also ask for this paperwork. So I can't work with the smaller players, even though I'd like to. So this is another example of like regulation basically pricing out smaller companies, especially in agriculture and food production, and basically because it's hard for them to comply. So compliance cost can be very high, but for a big company it's a tiny portion of their profits, but for a small company it's a very large portion of their profits. So yeah, this is a common problem, and I like to think it's something that's getting better. I think policy people tend to look at problems, they tend to look at okay, we need to fix these problems, and they don't tend to think about, and again this is especially true in the EU, they don't tend to think about the I guess like the operational side of things. Okay, now you have to fill in all these forms, now you have to do all this paperwork, and I think farming is a good example of that. You see how as soon as the farm is like a medium-sized farm, you need a person on full salary doing paperwork for you to basically comply with all the government regulations. And I think if you haven't seen it, Clarkson's farm is a great sort of, I guess, insight into how all of that works. It's kind of mind-boggling actually. So what's the conclusion here? I think basically what I'm trying to say is that like the regulatory moat is absolutely a real thing, and it is usually, it comes from a good place. So with the EU, it's often, you know, people are trying to fix some problem, say food safety, some kind of issue, consumer protection, etc., and it usually comes from a good place. However, a lot of the time what you also see is big companies, they lobby and they spend money on trying to push for more regulation, because more regulation for them means less competition. So this has absolutely happened in the EU. I can't name an example, but this is absolutely a thing. You can look it up. So sometimes that happens as well, and on the surface that comes from a good place, but in reality it's actually big companies just trying to consolidate, I guess, market dominance by kind of making the regulations so strict that a new player can't enter the market and compete. So this is always like compliance and policy making is always a balance of these two things. And like I said, I'm not familiar with how this is in most of the world. I'm most familiar with how this works in the EU, and it's a mixed bag. I think a lot of the stuff that the EU is good, probably majority of things, and I think a lot of it is also problematic. So yeah, I wanted to talk about this regulatory moat, so-called, what it is, and how it tends to work. So yeah, I hope that was interesting. Thanks for watching. Bye.